Welcome to Whiskey Lore, The Interviews. I'm your host, Drew Hanisch, the best-selling author of Whiskey Lore's Travel Guide to Experiencing Kentucky Bourbon. And after a short hiatus, I am back and ready to dig into more whiskey history, or in this case, distilling history, as today's focus is going to be on the oldest distilling company in the United States, having received their very first license back in the 1700s. The distillery is Laird's, and my guests today are Lisa Laird Dunn, the company COO, and Gerard Dunn, operations manager at Laird's. Welcome, guys, to the show.
Thank you, Drew. Happy to be here.
Thank you. Yeah, we're excited to be here today.
So you guys have been on my list to talk to for a long time, ever since I first heard about Applejack and apple brandy and the history behind your distillery. And it's like, if I'm going to talk about distilleries in the United States, I should be looking for the ones that have the most significant in terms of historical timelines. And so since you stretch to the earliest date of a operating distillery, perfect to have you guys on. And also, it's a chance for me to learn a little bit about the history of Applejack and what that is. I don't know if a lot of people have heard of that before, except for maybe a breakfast cereal that they had as a kid. And then also talk about brandy, some of the differences, and the unique distilling style, as well as doing a tasting of your 10th generation apple brandy, which is a bottled in bond, and so we'll dig into that as well. So I guess the first place to start is to introduce this concept of Applejack, and what is Applejack and what makes it different from apple brandy.
Well, technically there really is no difference by the federal standard of identity between Applejack and apple brandy. They are synonymous. If you look at the federal standard of identities, it'll say apple brandy, also known as Applejack, which is produced from 100% apples. Historically, the term apple brandy, Applejack, cider spirits were all interchangeable as well. So there really isn't a difference. There were two different processes or distilling methods in the colonial era. So that is where many people will say the difference between Applejack and apple brandy lies. But there were producers of Applejack that were distilling in both methods in the colonial era. So the two methods. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, so this is fascinating for me because the original method is one that I never had even considered in my mind would be a way that you could do fermentation. But go ahead and kind of describe that original method.
So the original method was by freeze distillation. So what a lot of the colonists did, they did not have stills. There were mostly farmers that were doing it on their farms. There were, as early as, I guess, the mid-1600s, there were stills here in the New World. So people were using heat distillation as well. But the freeze distillation, they would, chop up the apples. And there were two methods. They could leave all of the solids together, or they could strain it off, and they would put it in a barrel, and they would let it ferment. And then during the winter, they would leave the fermented juice, which was hard cider, and they would let it freeze. So as you know, water freezes before alcohol. So as the water would freeze, they would chip away the ice, and they would remove the ice. And it would be a continuous process through the winter, and it would condense the alcohol and condense the entire product, I guess, that's in the barrel. So it would become just alcohol. But the problem with this method, it would leave... obviously you want to leave some of the congeners because that's the flavor of a spirit, but it would leave a little bit too much of the methanol and the esters, some that we do like to distill off. So it was a little bit of a harsher, I would probably say a lot more harsher method to produce the product.
Okay. And that's interesting because when you think about the heat distillation process and the ability to say, okay, we're going to take out the hearts of this and we're going to discard or redistill the heads and the tails, the first thing I'm thinking when you're chipping away ice is you're really not, you can't stick a hydrometer into your block of ice, even if they had them back at that time. So you're kind of in a spot where you're going to get some of that harsher alcohol in there. But this is one of the things I have heard over time, and I'm not sure whether you know this or not, but when you go on tours and they talk about distillation and how the moonshiners, some of them maybe left the methanol in there when they were doing the distillation and it would kill people. I've also heard that the methanol and the ethanol actually offset each other. So it wouldn't necessarily kill you, but it wouldn't be great for your health to do that. But it sounds like in doing the freeze-dried method, you're basically probably leaving most of that methanol in there, but it wasn't killing people.
Absolutely. No, they had a term called apple palsy. If you drank too much of the freeze distillation method, because it was also, we're talking about the name Applejack. Freeze distillation was also called jacking. So hence you were taking the apple cider and you were jacking it. So that's predominantly how we feel the name Applejack came from. It's not written down anywhere in history, but we're pretty sure that's where the name originated from. But yes, there was a term called apple palsy. So if you drank, especially during, Prohibition, which, Applejack was very widely distilled during Prohibition. And, but if you drank too much of some of the jacked Applejack that had a little bit too much of the methanol in it, there was a term you kind of like pass out, and we call it apple palsy.
Luckily, we don't have a lot of that going on these days.
No, we do not, thankfully. And our families always use the heat distillation method, so
okay, that answers my next question. Now let's go back with your family, and what is the earliest that you know of that your family was distilling apple brandy and Applejack?
Well, our ancestor, which was back in 1678, they arrived here from Scotland, and we're assuming that he was a Scotch distiller. We're not sure if he brought a still with him, or obviously he knew how to build one. But it was 1698 where he settled where we're located today. It was Alexander and his son William who came over, and it was William who came to this location. And we, through family lore, that he was distilling as early as 1698 in this location because apples were very abundant. The English brought the first apple seeds over here in the early 1630s, and they flourished very well here because the only original native apple is the crab apple. So all of the apples were imported from England.
Wow.
So
did not know that.
Yes. So the apples flourished. And of course, colonists, throughout history, anywhere in the world, they always found a way to make alcohol out of any type of raw material that they could find. So they started producing cider spirits here. So that is when we originally began our distilling, but we use 1780 as our official start date because we have account book of operations from our ancestor, Robert Laird.
Wow. Okay. And that goes all the way back to that date.
To 1780, that we have a written record.
To 1780, yeah. Okay.
Yes,
okay.
Yes. 1698, back then they were more like bartering. People pretty much bartered between Whatever you could produce, you were bartering to get other supplies and so forth.
So were they distilling apple brandy in England? This shows me how little I know about brandy and its background.
Mm-hmm. Our family, no. We came from Scotland, but in England, they do produce apple brandy in England.
Okay. All right.
Yes.
Very good. I'm figuring the apples coming across. Plus, they are, that much closer to France, where they would have been distilling grapes down there. So then all of a sudden, I think of the traditional farmer distiller of early America, where they were distilling their grain for the purpose of, as you say, bartering. Basically, it was their currency. It was a way that they could pay their rents and the rest. But you actually, what was the original setup? Because you actually had an inn attached to this, and it makes me wonder, was the inn something that developed out of the fact that you had a successful farm and you were already making the brandy, or was the inn what kind of pushed you into the idea of, well, we have an inn, we have a tavern, we should have something for people to drink?
Well, we were producing the Applejack before there was the inn. The inn wasn't built until 1717, the Colts Neck Inn.
Okay.
And it was a stagecoach stop. It was the Burlington Path, and it was from the Atlantic to the Delaware. So it went across the state of New Jersey into Pennsylvania. So it was great because people learned about the product and would take it with them as they traveled through. Because obviously we were serving it in the inn. The distillery was located behind the inn. But as you were saying, before the inn, there was the bartering. And even when we had the inn throughout the 1600s into the 1700s, barter was very popular, and even into the 1800s. But Applejack was used to pay road crews. It was also, there's a diary entry where I saw that a farmer had used a barrel of his Applejack to pay for his children's schooling. So I think the original apple that was given to teachers was not an actual apple, it was Applejack.
Nice. Well,
but yeah, the inn, it was actually, we were the proprietors. It was built by another family. We had the distillery there. It was the Hart family. And when she became a widow, we ran the inn for her for many years at that location.
Okay. And there was a fire, 1849, I believe, is the date I saw on your website. So do you know where the old inn was? Is that still connected in terms of property to what you guys currently have?
The inn is still open and operating.
Is it?
Yes. We are not connected to it in any way. The distillery did burn down, and at that point, the inn and distillery was being run by Samuel Laird, which was our great-great-great-great-grandfather. Three greats. Samuel. I get lost with the greats sometimes, but he was our three greats grandfather, or mine, Gerard's fourth great. So we had the fire, and at that point, his son Robert moved the distillery about 1.5 miles down the road, right down Route 537 to where we're located today. So the inn stayed there. Unfortunately, the distillery burned to the ground, which that happened a lot. Yeah. You have fire, alcohol. Yeah, it's going to happen. But yes, that's when in our 340-year history, we moved once. This is our new location as of the mid 1800s. Nice.
So you're in, is it Schofield?
Scobeyville.
Scobeyville,
yes. Which is a little area of Colts Neck.
Okay.
Yeah, it was named after Captain Joshua Scobey, who was a pirate.
Okay. And you are right, it's not far from New York City. You're closer to New York City than you are to Philadelphia?
Yes. Yeah, I guess it's
about an hour to New York City and like an hour and 15 to Philadelphia.
Yeah.
Okay.
Kind of right in the middle.
Yeah, kind of right in the middle.
How far are you from Monmouth?
We are within Monmouth County.
Yeah, we are in Monmouth County.
Are you? Okay. So there's an interesting tie-in to George Washington, which I've been over to the Washington distillery. Of course, there was a battle that was really pretty much the last battle in the Northeast that occurred at Monmouth Courthouse, and that was in 1778. Now, it sounds like George Washington may have visited the inn at some point, or somehow he learned of your Applejack. But do you have much of a story behind that?
Yeah, absolutely. Robert Laird, who was running the distillery during the Revolution and prior, was a Revolutionary War dragoon under the command of George Washington, along with his brother Richard. And actually, the Colts Neck Inn was used as a meeting place for the planners of the Revolution. And there was a very famous soldier that from this area, which was Captain Huddy, Captain Joshua Huddy, was located. He lived actually right next door to the Colts Neck Inn. So as you know, George Washington obviously was in this area. We had the Battle of Monmouth, which was very, very famous, which, you know, it's been passed down that we did supply the troops with Applejack while they were in the area. But George Washington did ask Robert how he produced his Applejack, because he did have an excess of apples down at Mount Vernon. And Robert obviously did share the recipe with George Washington, and he began distilling cider spirits down at Mount Vernon.
Okay.
And another little interesting tidbit, you know, or anecdote about the Revolutionary War and our little connection, especially with George Washington. Robert and Richard's uncle, Moses Laird, served as a guide to George Washington when he was in Monmouth County. So as George Washington traveled through the colonies during the Revolutionary War, obviously he did not know local terrain. So he would hire local people within the area to guide him, to make sure they were, you know, not going into ambush areas, you know, obviously a lot of marshland and so forth. And in this area, it was a Laird family member, Moses Laird. And George Washington and his officers did have a meal. They were hosted by the Laird family for supper one night.
It's fascinating, again, how, especially during the time of George Washington, where rations had to include some form of alcohol to keep the troops happy. And so there was, we talk in history about how once rum was really not available because of the British being in, you know, the ones controlling the areas where that molasses was coming from, this shift into whiskey at that particular point. But we seem to forget that also brandy was cider and brandy were very popular drinks back in that time period.
Absolutely. Brandy was very, very popular, especially the Applejack, apple brandy. You know, there was other fruit brandies, but cider spirits was very predominant, especially in the Northeast.
So in that day when they were doing distillation, was it basically just one pot still they were running it through? We talked today about double distillation and the rest, and the Irish, now that I'm doing my research on them, you know, triple distillation is the way we need to go. But how much do you know about how they were distilling at that time? And like when we think about the George Washington setup and how he has his 5 wood-fired pot stills there, what was the setup as far as you know it from that time period?
As far as we know, it was a wood-fired pot still.
Was it? Okay.
Especially the old stills that we have, the oldest still we have at this location was a wood-fired pot still as well.
Okay.
In the mid-1800s.
Yeah. How many relics do you have around of those old days? I mean, again, I think of distillers in that day didn't really think so much about posterity and that people would really even care what they were doing 100 years from now. But here we are going, give us information. We want to know what they were doing.
It's very unfortunate that a lot of that information was not saved. We do have the original still here from the mid-1800s. That's as far back as we actually have the equipment. But yeah, and then, we have the account book of operations from the late 1700s. But at that point in time, he was just not a distiller. He was running the inn. He had, had mercantile. So it had various different entries. But that's when we see the first entry for cider spirits.
Was he buying in apples, or did you guys have an orchard associated with the grounds?
We purchased the apples.
Okay.
As far as I know, we never had an apple orchard ourselves, but, back in the early 1700s, late 1700s, we could have had some apple orchards. I'm not 100% sure. Obviously there's a lot of open land here, and there's a lot of apple orchards where I'm located. So we could have at one point in time, but I have no record of that.
Okay. And in terms of bottling, about what time period do you think that bottling of the spirit started instead of just selling it by barrel?
Well, the oldest bottle that we have in our family's possession is from the mid-1800s, and it's just a large amber. You can see it's crackle glass and just had a wax top. So we know at least by the mid-1800s, when we were in this location, we were using glass bottles. Probably it could be early 1800s, but I'm not sure of the exact date, but I know we were using bottles by the mid-1800s.
Okay, and probably ceramic jugs as well?
Yep, lots of ceramic jugs. Back then the bottles, they weren't a certain size, you know what I mean? They were just blowing the glass, and whatever contents was there, that was it, but the bottle, it's interesting to see how the bottles changed. We have one bottle from the mid-1800s and then one from about 1890, where then we had a cork closure versus the wax closure, and then, moving on to metal screw caps and so forth as the technology progressed.
It's fascinating to know, and I've just started digging into the history of bottle making to kind of understand why was it that bottling really didn't occur until the Bottled in Bond Act happened, and then all of a sudden distillers were seeing an advantage to doing it. And really there was no automated process. In fact, it wasn't until I think around 1910 or somewhere in that time period that we got to a point where now we have machinery that can produce bottles en masse. Otherwise, it was still, there had to be some hands-on going on in the late 1800s, and prior to that, you were making the bottle from scratch. I mean, it was really a laborious task, and so we didn't get to see labels, and we don't get to see, there wasn't really a need to do the same kind of marketing that we do today with, let's have a logo, and let's have it was, what brand are you putting on a barrel, probably, which may just be your name rather than some kind of a symbol. Exactly.
The oldest package that we have, it just says Robert Laird Distilling Company and Apple Brandy. Didn't have to have the contents. There was no logo. Our logo didn't appear until post-Prohibition.
Oh, really? Okay.
That's when we first have a logo, which we then changed. That's the logo that we have on our Bottled and Bond products. It's the apple with the brandy snifter. And then in, I guess it was 1951, where we started using the eagle on some of our other products. Okay.
And let's talk about Prohibition and how that affected the business. Because, first of all, I know that different states have gone into Prohibition earlier than national Prohibition. I don't know if you went through that, and you actually were in two states at that time, were you not? No, not yet.
At this point, no. We were just in New Jersey.
Just in New Jersey. Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So you went by New Jersey law. Be interesting to know. Do you know if New Jersey waited and only went into Prohibition with everybody else?
That's a good question. I think we went with everybody else. This really wasn't a temperance type state, so I don't think we closed early.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure it was when we were forced to. We actually have newspaper articles where, say, goodbye to Applejack. And I'll have to look at the dates, but I'll have to look at the dates of some of those newspapers.
Yeah.
The articles that we have.
Be interesting to know. In the South, that a lot of them went in early. I was surprised to see, Tennessee talks about 1910, 1909, and 1910. But then as I dug in, I found out that North Carolina was already in Prohibition by that time, and Alabama was already in Prohibition during that time. So I think it may have been more of the Baptist influence that.
Absolutely, it was the Baptist. There may even be some dry counties in North Carolina still to this day. I mean, I know there were, like 30 years ago when I was working the market, there's still dry areas.
Yeah, we were just talking about Tennessee. Tennessee still has some that are dry.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, and Kentucky has a lot, actually. And again, it's because the Catholic areas fought not to go into Prohibition, but there were many more Baptist areas that pushed in that direction. So, but you guys would have a major advantage. It's like I think about Prohibition and what the brewers did. Some of the brewers went in and shifted their business model to making, like I remember Stroh's ice cream, and that actually survived Prohibition, and they made ice cream. They may still make Stroh's ice cream, I don't know, but they found other things to do to survive. And here you're working with a product that you're fermenting, but it's also a viable product if you don't ferment it. So is there, what happened with the company at that time? Did you shift to another product, or did you shut down?
Well, we were producing some non-alcoholic products for a while. We had apple cider, apple juice, and it, as I had mentioned before, during Prohibition, Applejack was very popular bootleg product. I'm not sure who we were selling all that apple juice to and apple cider. We could have been just selling it to the bootleggers, because I'm not sure how much people were actually consuming non-alcoholic apple cider. But then, we did shut down for a short time. My grandfather then introduced a apple soda called 5 Apple, made from the apple juice. And then he decided, it was John Evans Laird, my grandfather, Gerard's great-grandfather, and he petitioned the federal government to produce for medicinal purposes, which there were a few whiskey producers that were producing for medicinal purposes. So we were granted the permit to produce 1 million gallons of apple brandy a year. And as we know, there was prescriptions for alcohol during Prohibition.
Yeah, and this is one of those myths that's kind of built up over time, that there were only 6 medicinal licenses that were handed out. There were more. It's just they don't really get publicized, because it seems Kentucky tells our history. And so those distilleries being associated with Kentucky is why they get mentioned. But there were many other, especially in the late 1920s, when they were running out of medicinal spirits, they had to create more. So they had to look for a way. The government actually opened up and said, we have to find a way to be able to get more of these producers creating spirits for the market. So we had a very sick populace in the 1920s, apparently.
But I love, like, one of the ailments where you could receive a prescription was depression.
Ah. So
like,
here, have
Who wasn't depressed during Prohibition, right?
Yeah, exactly. And what's funny about that is alcohol is not really a stimulant. So, yeah, interesting times. So, do those products survive? Did the soda survive?
No. We stopped all the non-alcoholic. We did later on, we were producing some applesauce, and we had a cannery down the street that we had that facility as well. But no, we're just doing alcohol now. It's all alcoholic products.
So, and what's funny, there's a book called Last Call. Daniel Okrent wrote about Prohibition, and one of the funniest stories in there is the story of a man who had a vineyard out in California, and they would basically send out grape juice with instructions on how to, with warnings on, please do not do these particular steps, or you will create wine, which is illegal, right? So he's basically kept himself in business selling his product to everybody, and basically giving them the formula to make alcohol out of it, with a warning that that's not what you're supposed to do. So you definitely had to get creative back in those days.
Obviously, he was a very savvy businessman.
Yes, he was. So you guys actually hold DSP NJ1. In other words, you are registered as the first distillery in New Jersey. So what is the what time period did you apply for that?
Well, that would have been post-Prohibition.
Okay.
When we had more regulations that we were under. We also have Internal Revenue Bonded Warehouse number 1.
Okay.
We are the first bonded warehouse in the country.
Wow.
And at that point, we had Federal Distillery number 1 as well that were on our labels. They were all included on our labels.
So I think it's around the 1860s that bonding warehouses first were introduced. Is that about the time? Was that the time period?
Yeah, probably with the Bottled and Bond Act was
1897.
1897. I'm
like,
I got so many dates in my head.
Yeah, but there was a bonding. But bonding was going on before that. It was that it. There were no real major advantages to it in the past. The real push for it, I think, came with the 97 legislation.
Yes.
So,
to ensure the quality of product.
Exactly.
People were doing a lot of nefarious things to their spirits and smacking labels on it.
Yeah, well, this is the thing, too, that I don't think a lot of whiskey drinkers are aware of, is that law isn't just for whiskey. It's for any aged spirits in the United States.
Yes.
So
everybody thought it was just for whiskeys, but we've had our bottled and bond products since Prohibition, obviously beforehand as well. But we have one product, our original bottled and bond, which is very popular with the bartending community. That when we look through our old colas, certificate of label approvals, it's the same label back to 1941.
Wow. Okay. And you eventually ended up in Virginia as well. So kind of talk about what happened to create that move to Virginia. And I'm assuming you're now basically maintaining both states at this point.
Well, we no longer distill in New Jersey. There is no source of apples in New Jersey any longer. We're very developed. I actually live in an old apple orchard, the housing development that I live in.
Wow.
So in the mid-'70s, we stopped distilling in New Jersey. But as, post-Prohibition, it was the heyday of Applejack, especially the 30s, 40s, 50s, and moving into the early 60s. And so Applejack and our apple brandy is produced from apples. Our federal standard of identity has to be 100% apples. So we are kind of restricted to a certain time of year. Apples become ripe, end of August, into September throughout the fall season. So we could only produce from September. We would start crushing early September whenever we could start receiving apples. And we're usually done distilling, barreling by the end of December. So we were very limited on when we could produce and how much we could produce. So demand was very high, so we purchased 2 additional distilleries in 1941. One was up in Lyons, New York, outside of Syracuse. That was the original Hildix Applejack, if it's an old label. Not sure if you've ever come across that in your looking through history and so forth, but that was a very historical product. And in the second distillery we purchased was in, well, is in, we're still distilling this facility in North Garden, Virginia, outside of Charlottesville. And that was called the Virginia Fruit Distilling Company and had a product that was called Captain Applejack, which we still offer in Virginia and North Carolina.
Okay.
So it was due to the demand. We needed to fulfill demand, so we purchased the 2 additional distilleries.
And what's interesting is 2 of America's most popular spirits during the Revolution all the way up through the 1800s, and now, as you point out, into the early post-Prohibition era would be rye whiskey and brandy. Rye whiskey almost disappeared completely, and it was really only saved by maybe Sazerac hanging on and maybe a spirit here or there. But did brandy go through the same kind of a downturn? And brandy is one of those things that maybe we can talk a little bit, too, about people's perception of brandy, because I think a lot of people see it as a French spirit, as something that is for the upper class and nobody else really drinks it, or they think about like cheap cream. Well, I'm thinking sherry in that particular case, but kind of talk about brandy's evolution, or maybe how it has been perceived over the 20th century into now.
It's very sad what has happened to the brandy category, especially here in America. Europe, they fully understand what brandy is. It's the American culture. Unfortunately, we lost a lot of producers. Number one, brandy is more expensive to produce than whiskey. Grains are much cheaper than fruit. The quantity that we have to use, just to give you an idea, it takes 7,000 pounds of apples to produce 1 barrel of Applejack. And that's 55 gallons, so 53 gallons of liquid. And that's at 130 proof. So the raw material we have to use is enormous. It's about 3 times as much as grains. So number one, you had the expense factor and to produce it. So many people just stopped producing it. After Prohibition, you had a lot of great product that was out there, and then as you were moving into the world wars, during that time period, there were some people that were just not making good brandy. They were adding things to it, and there was just a lot of, quality issues. Actually, my family purchased a lot of, about 150 other Applejack, either distilleries or labels, to protect the integrity of the product, because it was just getting such a bad reputation. And then, the American consumers were moving away from heavy spirits, heavy brown spirits. That's when we lost rye. They were lightening. Rye became blended whiskey.
Yeah.
Scotches were lightened. Canadian was lightened. We actually had to petition for a new federal standard of identity of blended Applejack in order to survive. We have our Laird's blended Applejack, which is our most widely distributed product today, which is basically an apple whiskey, I call it, because it's apple brandy blended with neutral grain to lighten it. If we did not receive that, we probably would have been out of business a while ago, because by our federal standard of identity, as I said earlier, Applejack has to be made from 100% apples. So, we had less and less. People were spirits, their tastes were moving towards lighter and then sweeter spirits, and we have this category that is called flavored brandy that has really grown in popularity, I guess, in the 70s and 80s.
Okay.
So the American consumer thinks flavored brandy is brandy. And the flavored brandy, like, you have, when there's peach and apple and peppermint, every flavor under the sun you can think of, which doesn't have an ounce of brandy in it. It's basically a neutral grain spirit that's flavored and colored.
Wow. But it carries the name brandy?
It carries the name brandy, which irritates the heck out of me, because it is not a brandy. And now American consumers, they see apple brandy, they think it's going to be sweet and it's going to taste like apples, that it's not this wonderful spirit that it is. And this is only in the United States that this has happened.
It's fascinating.
And we're trying to re-educate, which has been an uphill battle.
So how do they get away with that if it's not? I mean, is it because of the loosening of the standard on the blended that it basically opened the door to adding flavors? No,
because we are the only. You can't add with the blended Applejack category. We're the only producers. It can only be apple brandy. It has to be a minimum of 20% apple brandy and the balance neutral grain spirits. No flavors whatsoever. Our blended Applejack is 35% apple brandy, 65% neutral grain. So the flavors did not come in there. It came in along with the DSS, the distilled spirit specialty, and eventually, not sure where it came about and who was the first to come up with this idea of let's do flavored brandies and be able to call these flavored products a brandy.
Is there any chance, just like bourbon did in 1964, that you can lobby Congress to come up with a standard for brandy that deletes this ability to add flavorings to it?
Well, we do have our federal standard of identity for brandy and fruit brandies. We would have to petition to eliminate the flavored brandy category, which I am all for. Anybody wants to get on board with me, I'm happy to lead the charge, because it irritates me, because we have for over 300 years have distilled this wonderful spirit, and for people to not understand that and think a brandy is sweet and tastes like a fruit, that's a cordial.
Yeah.
That's a liqueur. That's not a brandy.
It's kind of in that moonshine area, or I saw the other day, and I've seen this around, flavored whiskeys, and it's, I get it. There is a market for that. There's a big market for that. But for the person who is trying to find something that is that comes from the distiller's craft rather than from a heavy-handed approach of sticking a flavor in to manipulate the spirit. It feels like for us, the consumers, it makes it very confusing as to what is a legitimate spirit. I don't want to call those not legitimate, but in terms of that it came from the craft rather than from manipulation.
Exactly. But one difference between the flavored brandies and the flavored whiskey, the flavored whiskeys do have a whiskey base to it.
Right.
These flavored brandies that I'm talking about from the 70s and 80s that started, and there's many of them on the market today. There's not an ounce of brandy in them. So there is a difference there. There are some flavored brandies now, but that have brandy. It's just become very convoluted.
Yeah. Do you feel encouraged now by the fact that there are more distilleries starting to jump on board and discover brandy? I've talked to a few distillers who are diving into making brandies now, even though the process is a bit stickier and difficult maybe for them to do versus their regular distillation of grains?
It is creating more awareness of brandies, which is wonderful. It's helping, it's definitely assisting to educate consumers around the country of what this spirit is.
Yeah.
So yes, it's a plus for sure. You know, we're a small family business. We can't do it all on our own. So it's wonderful to see all these different brandies that are actually made from the fruit.
Yeah.
And it's a craft, and it's a positive.
Yeah. So Gerard, let's jump in a little bit on the process side of things. And what is your kind of give us a view into the distillery as it is now, and maybe walk us through the process a little bit of how you produce the brandies these days.
So, being a small family business, everything is still mostly done through manual labor down at our distillery in North Garden. We purchase apples from a few local farms. We deal with two mainly, and then sometimes we reach out to a tertiary. But my grandpa still purchases apples from the same gentleman that he's been working with over 30 years now.
Mm-hmm.
And
post Prohibition, we've been working.
Nice.
And he still goes down at the beginning of every season and negotiates a price per pound, and it's all a handshake deal, very old school. So once we purchase apples from the farm, it gets delivered to our distillery, and it's crushed in a hopper and then pumped into these giant presses. And we have two gentlemen that work the presses at a time, and that fresh juice is squeezed out and then strained to get any solids out, where the juice is then pumped into a fermentation tank. From the fermentation tank, it takes anywhere from 2 to 10 days, all depending on the temperature outside. And we have a proprietary blend where we don't want to say how we ferment, but anywhere from 2 to 10 days, mostly temperature dependent from the weather outside. And every day, our master distiller checks the acids and the pH of our cider, so that when it's ready to go and it reaches our qualifications and specs, we fire the still up, and it takes about 24 to 48 hours to run a full fermentation tank of about 17,000 gallons? 14,000 gallons. And that still runs continuously until that fermentation tank is run through. And if we have more than one tank ready, then we just roll over right into the second. So we're working those night shifts is a lot of fun, especially when the weather gets cold down there.
Oh, I bet.
Yeah, but the still house is nice and warm.
The still house is right.
People are lobbying to get near the stills. Yeah. Nice.
A lot of late nights in that still house.
So are you running it through a single distillation, double distillation?
Our still is a pot still combined with a column still.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's like a continuous distillation.
Okay. All right. Very good. Yeah, it's interesting to see. Again, I had to readjust my brain after I came back from Ireland because everybody's doing 2 or 3 pot stills, and you just get used to seeing that. And then I'm back in Kentucky, and I'm looking at this, going, oh, wait a second. Yeah, that's right. Hybrid stills and, going through plates, and what is the process here? It interests me, too, because when I was in Ireland, I was told at a famous distillery, which I will not name, but everybody will probably guess because it's one of the ones that everybody sees on the shelf when they go look for Irish whiskey. But they were saying, American whiskey is only single distilled, whereas Scotch is double distilled and Irish is triple distilled, which is a pretty generic way to come across and say it, especially when you consider that same distillery uses a column still for part of the product that they're producing, so it's not all necessarily triple distilled. But this idea that it runs through the still one time, does it go to do you have a thumper or a doubler along with that, or does it just end at the column still, at the hybrid still?
Yeah, we have a doubler.
You do have a doubler, okay.
And we continuously, as I said, it's like a continuous distillation, and we put the heads and the tails back in and redistill.
Okay. So it's in a way you're distilling the way a lot of bourbon distillers are distilling their spirits these days. So,
okay. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So let's talk about the particular. Let's talk about barreling first, because that's also another interesting piece for me, and aging and how long you like to age your spirits for. Again, in the early days, it was probably more about keeping it in a container of some form rather than necessarily trying to impart flavors out of the barrel. But in terms of what you're doing now and getting that influence of oak on a brandy, what would you say is a optimal time probably for a brandy to sit in a barrel?
That's difficult.
Yeah.
It depends on what you're looking for. If you want more of the bright fruit, or do you want some more of the nuances of the wood, the spice and the vanilla and so forth. So it depends on what you're looking for. We don't go any longer than 12 because the distillate, apple brandy, is a very delicate product. The longer you age, you're losing the apple characteristics. We feel it's very important to retain as much of those apple characteristics as possible, because we're not producing a whiskey, we're producing an apple brandy. We have found we don't go over the age of 12.
Okay.
In order to find that's the sweet spot. After that, it just starts to become too much wood. And we also use used cooperage. We do not use any new barrels because it's just too strong. You'll get a wonderful vanilla, wonderful wood characteristics, but you lose the apple totally.
So you're using ex-bourbon barrels, kind of like Scotch does? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Very interesting. Well, and it sounds very similar to peated whiskeys and rye whiskeys, where if you're in love with the character of what was being distilled, the longer it sits in that barrel, the less it's about that flavor and what you're looking for, and much more about the barrel itself.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And every barrel is different. Every barrel is going to impart, a little bit different characteristics. But we love our apple distillate. We actually bottle. People can call it moonshine. We call it Jersey Lightning. We call it Jersey Lightning because it's like a moonshine, but New Jersey was very well known for the best production of Applejack. So we offer that for sale as well, our unaged distillate, which, that's how proud we are of it, because it's an absolutely beautiful, beautiful product, and it shows you what we start with.
Yeah. So once you're in the barrel, I'm assuming you're probably bringing in some of those toffee notes and, maybe adding some wood spice to it, that sort of thing, a little nuttiness on top of the flavor that you get out of the brandy itself. So, but when you drink that distillate without the aging, do the apples just really stand out, kind of take to the forefront of the experience?
Yes, you get bright, fresh, cooked apples, but you also get a lot of the terroir. You're getting some stems, like green stem. You're getting some vegetal. You're actually getting a little peach and pear in there, which I think is because the orchards where we are, there's also peaches grown, so it could be coming from that. But it's it's definitely a different experience, and it's very bright, very fresh, and it's very. We offer it at 50% alcohol, so it's still quite strong, but it's very soft, almost like a meringue type finish.
I love that you keep your proofing elevated that way, because to me it gives you much more flavor impact when you do that. So how does it? How has the transition gone, and how are you transitioning now into the 10th generation of distiller? What is your process? It sounds like you have 3 generations still available at this point.
Yes, we do.
Yeah.
Yes. My grandfather, Lisa's father, is still very heavily involved.
Okay.
He's here probably like 7:30 to 5 every day. His favorite thing to do is drive the forklift and load the trucks. So he'll be here for the foreseeable future, no doubt. So we're in an interesting transition period where we're still having Lisa try to take the reins from my grandfather. But I'm just doing my best to learn under both of them. It's an interesting transition, but all 3 of us are heavily involved. But I'd say Lisa, my mother here, is calling the main shots.
Yeah. Well, and I'm sure that there are plenty of opinions around when you have that many generations.
Oh, yeah. You see me rolling my eyes over here? I've got it from both ends, the older generation, the younger generation, it's quite interesting. But I do enjoy having Gerard here, because now I have somebody in my corner for some things, someone backing me up on some things that I want to adjust and my father's very old school. He has been doing this. He's 82 years old. He has been doing this since he was a teenager. So it's in his blood, and he's very, very passionate.
Yeah.
Which has definitely transitioned to me and now to Gerard. It's his soul. Like it's amazing. Like that's how much this means to him, and he can just whiff a glass of brandy and tell you the ester, acids,
Wow.
methanol, everything. We have to tread lightly.
Well, I think back to when my dad taught me how to drive a stick shift car, and he had done it for so long that he couldn't put into words how to tell you how to do it, which led to me having to make mistakes and then kind of learn on my own. I imagine you kind of go through that same sort of thing, that it's in his head. He's been doing it so long. Sometimes it's hard to translate that to the next generation and say how to do it.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
Especially learning the distilling process. And, it's funny. I have a lot of people ask me all these chemical questions. And he's like, I'm not a chemist. I just taste it. Like, he just tastes it. Like he can't give you chemical compounds and so forth. So it's interesting how the old timers and how, a lot of younger people are looking at distillation. It's all touch, feel, taste. It's all your senses, for all these years distilling.
Yeah. Fascinating. Well, they say that family businesses, usually when they get to the 3rd generation, that's tough. You've gone 10, so you guys have learned how to do these transitions and make it through. I'm sure it's got to be fun hearing some of the insights from the past as well, and really feeling that history being channeled in to you from the older generations as well. So
yeah, it is. It's fascinating, and I love to hear as many stories as possible. And learn as much as I can, and just when we're in the old distillery, and my father telling stories when he was down there distilling, and with all the development here in New Jersey, obviously the underwater rivers have changed. A little. He'd be standing in water. But you have to have the water source to run a still where it's located. So, but just his stories and the nights there, and it's fascinating. But I love trying to absorb as much of that history as possible, because people love to hear the personal stories. Not just boom, boom, boom. This is how we make the product. It's the lore. Whiskey lore. Exactly. The name of your podcast. It's the history and the lore and the people. That's what really makes the story.
Yeah. It's what drew me into the whiskey industry and in the spirits industry in general, is that you can look at the bottle on the shelf, but it doesn't tell you the whole story. And when I do distillery tours, I look forward to hearing somebody not just give me names and dates, but to bring in some of those quirky little stories that come along, or things that happened over time, or just understanding really how distilleries had to survive through all of the changes in American culture or overseas through the cultural changes there, and survive downtimes when people weren't interested in your spirit as much as they would have been interested in another type of spirit, and seeing those cycles and all of that. So it all comes back to really these distilleries and these spirits being living, breathing things in terms of they evolve just like we evolve over time. So, but we hold on to the history as well, and that's the fun part. So
and that's one thing we have a lot of is history. And we actually just stopped distilling for a 10-year period because of the demand was so low,
Wow.
And as you said earlier, Applejack cereal, when I was young and first started in the industry, Applejack, is that the cereal? People had no clue what the product was. So now that there's a resurgence and a appreciation for brown spirits again, it's been quite refreshing.
So I actually met you guys in the oddest of ways, because normally I tend to reach out to a distillery and say, hey, I'd like to do an interview. And like I say, you guys have been on my mind for a long time. But it was actually Gerard was down here in South Carolina at a bourbon and bacon fest where I was peddling Scotch whiskey, which was an interesting experience. And then, Gerard, you came over and introduced yourself, which I'm glad you did, because it was so busy in there. I didn't get a chance to even start to move around there. But you gave me a chance to sip on your 10th generation bottled in bond. And so kind of describe where the concept of this came from. Is this something you've done for multiple generations, or is this kind of, hey, we're now at the magical 10, and let's jump in and do something special for that?
I think it was a combination of a lot of things. One of them being obviously me joining the family business. 10 is a nice, beautiful number. But our sales team has always wanted a nicer retail package that they could present to the end consumer. Lisa mentioned our bottled in bond product, our 4-year-old being beloved by the bartenders. Part of that comes with them never, ever wanting us to touch that label. As she said, it's been around since 1941. There's a lot of history behind that label, and it has a cult following. So to kind of please our sales team and celebrate me joining the business, we released this 5-year-old bottled in bond product called 10th Generation, and it's in a lot nicer of a retail package than our other bottled in bond product. So it was kind of a combination of all of that. Really brought it to life. Lisa spearheaded it. I was not really consulted or involved in the design of the package whatsoever.
Yeah.
But that is one thing she does great, of the many things she does great. And the package did come out beautiful. So I have no complaints whatsoever on how the product itself turned out and the package.
I was going to say, it could kind of look like an ego trip kind of thing if you were too involved in celebrating yourself.
Exactly.
So
I
that
graduated college, and she's like, "Here, what do you think of this?" And I'm like, "It's good."
Nice. How did you? Because I know my experience in terms of trying to sell bourbon drinkers on moving into Scotch whiskey, especially a peated Scotch whiskey. What was your experience in terms of? How did you feel you had to approach people who are bourbon drinkers when they walk by and go, "Oh, Brandy," and you know?
Yeah, they definitely kind of did a double take, and I would start off by saying, "Well, if you like bourbon, there's a good chance you're going to like this." And they were very, very hesitant. They wouldn't believe me, so it just kind of took a little convincing. All I had to do was at least convince them to at least try the product.
Yeah.
And 9 times out of 10, their eyes would light up, and they would be shocked and really surprised on how similar it is to a bourbon or a whiskey. Because going back to what Lisa was talking about before, it has that negative connotation of that flavored brandies that everyone immediately thinks of.
Yeah. And I honestly feel like in tasting it myself and nosing it, that it's kind of a marriage between, it's a bridge actually between Scotch, which you tend to, the non-peated Scotches, especially from Speyside, apple is a main characteristic that you find in that barley. You get a nice green apple kind of a flavor out of a lot of those Speyside whiskeys. So for me, it's actually maybe even closer to the Scotch fan than it would be to the bourbon fan. The barrel is definitely going to appeal to the bourbon fan and that sweet character that comes in. But like I say, I think it really fits in either direction. So
Absolutely. Kind of makes sense that William came from Scotland too.
there you go. Absolutely. So, wow. It's for the whiskey drinker to stick your nose in a glass and get that much apple. I love apples. Apple pie to me. We had an apple tree in our backyard when I was growing up, so we made homemade applesauce as well. Mm-hmm. And so I'm just crazy for apples, and to get them so much on the nose, there is a. I almost call it like a smokiness that comes in on the nose there as well. And you said your stills are fired stills.
Not any longer.
Okay.
No, they were years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah, no open flame any longer.
Yeah. It's you have to. You get in a habit when you're a whiskey drinker, I think, of having particular notes that you're always going to look for when you're drinking a bourbon. You're going to be looking for vanilla and maybe butterscotch, or finding that toffee note. Or if you're drinking a Scotch, you're looking for that apple note. You're looking for, if it's cherry influenced, maybe the darker fruits. And so I think the challenge for the whiskey drinker is throwing some of that out and discovering some new scents that you pick out of this, because there's a nice little bit of spice in there that comes in, like a baking spice that comes in on the nose. That isn't, it doesn't connect with me the same way in terms of scent as that same spice in a bourbon would. So it takes a few minutes to kind of go, oh, yeah, that is what that is. Kind of
I
an
think
experience.
also because it's not the new oak, bourbon is aged in the new oak, so you're going to get that stronger spice right off.
Yeah.
When you're immediately, it's going to hit you. This is a little more subtle.
Yeah.
And it's funny how you mentioned butterscotch, because one, we can really tell that what our distillation is superb is when we walk into the receiving room where the brandy is being dumped in from the still, and it smells like butterscotch.
Wow. The apple is, it's all there. It is definitely the star of the show on this. Even 5 years in the barrel, some cinnamon. I get a nice little bit of heat on the back of the tongue, which is really nice as well. I guess more of a cinnamon kind of a experience rather than it's not like a fireball
Absolutely.
kind of cinnamon, though. It's more of a peppery cinnamon, I guess would be the way to put it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
That's a perfect way to describe it.
very nice.
But the heat, with that extra age from, if you've ever had our 4-year-old bottle bond, it's definitely more heat. It's stronger. That extra age just smooths it out, helps dissipate that heat more quickly. So, for a lot of people, consumers that aren't used to a higher proof, this is definitely more
Kind of
palatable.
approachable. Yeah.
Approachable for sure, because it's amazing how smooth, we found, just from that one additional year. But definitely the cinnamon, I get the spice, definitely some vanilla, but it's almost like stewed, cooked apples, with all the spices that are involved in apple pie.
Yeah. And so what type of apples do you use for this?
We use basically the apples that you would find in a grocery store.
Mm-hmm.
Not all varieties. Mostly we use some reds and golds, Jonathan's, Granny Smith, Stamen, Winesap, Fuji, Gala, a little bit of Pink Lady.
Okay. And
It depends,
I was going to say, do you play with the balance, and does would that open up, like for instance, we talk in the whiskey industry now, corn and rye both have different varieties. So when you have a whiskey that is made out of a particular varietal of corn, you can sometimes get flavors out of it that you just really wouldn't expect. So do you sometimes play with the balance of this type of apple versus this type of apple in what you do?
We mostly, because the apples ripen at different times of the season, we, in order to, keep consistency, we more like blend the barrels from different times of the season.
Okay.
Because the different apples definitely produce a different brandy.
Yeah.
The early brandy is not as high in sugar bricks and is just not as good as, they're all good, but it's not at that same level as the late harvest apples.
Yeah.
And the later season brandy in November and December.
So
we usually use late harvest for our 7.5 and our 12-year-old for our, higher age spirits.
Okay.
That are just.
And where are you guys available? Are you available nationwide?
Yes, yeah. We're nationwide. We export in about 18 markets. So yeah, we're pretty, it's pockets of distribution. We're not going to be in every retail store in every state, more in the metro areas and, more of the suburban, depending on what market you're in. But we are available in all 50 states.
Okay, excellent. And if people want to look up and learn more about you, where can they do that? Do you have a web address, or are you on social media?
Yes, we are on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Instagram and Facebook would definitely be best in terms of learning more information. We also do have a website, www.lairdandcompany.com. And we have a ton of info on there. We have a history page that provides not all of our history, but kind of like the main important components. And we also have pages for each individual apple brandy expression that we produce, and it goes into a little bit more depth on how it's produced and the tasting notes and so forth.
Fantastic.
Yeah, and you can find our distributors in each market on the web page. You know, we don't list retailers.
Yeah.
Number one, it's just too vast. We wouldn't be able to keep up with it.
Yeah.
That would be like a full-time job for about 5 people. So, but yeah, at least you can find our distributor, or you can always reach out.
All right.
To us. And the Instagram, it's at Laird's Applejack.
Yes, the socials are at Laird's Applejack for both Facebook and Instagram.
Fantastic. Well, I appreciate you both coming on the show and talking about Applejack and apple brandy and giving us an introduction as well as such a fascinating and rich history that hopefully people will now walk down the brandy aisle as well as the whiskey aisle to see what else is out there and give your spirits a try. So, again, thank you so much for being on the show and sharing your story.
All right. Well, we're talking. Who's going to speak first? Well, I would like to thank you for assisting us in educating a little bit more about this wonderful historical spirit, because it is an uphill battle, as I had mentioned before. And so we really appreciate that you wanted to speak with us and learn more about the process and the history and our products. And so cheers to you as well. And it's definitely been our pleasure to be on this show.
Fantastic.
Yes. Thank you, Drew. I'm very happy we ran into each other at that festival down in Greenville. It was a lot of fun. We love talking about our history and our products. And it's with someone like you who genuinely appreciates everything behind it.
Well, good luck with your learning and absorbing all of the bits of information from previous generations. And I wish you guys a lot of luck, and I look forward to coming up to visit someday.
Oh, we would love to have you come visit. Thank you.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Cheers.